Welcome to ISO 9001-2015 awareness. The essence of this presentation basically is to enable you understand in detail what ISO 9001-2015 is all about, and then aside from that, we're also going to be going through what we refer to as the clauses. There are 10 clauses in ISO 9001. So at the end of this particular session, you're going to learn those 10 clauses, what they are. We shall also take a look at what we refer to as the principles that you have in ISO 9001, and then we shall also talk about how you will be able to implement ISO 9001 in your organization. And finally, we shall talk about audit, basically about how to carry out audit with regards to ISO 9001 and what to be on the lookout for in the event of an audit, and then also the various reports which can actually be an offshoot of an audit that is conducted within the organization. So this video is basically an attempt for me to explain to you how you're going to be able to implement ISO 9001 in your organization, the steps to follow, and then ultimately for you to have an understanding of what ISO 9001 is, as well as the requirements that goes along with ISO 9001. So once again, my name is Obalim and I'm going to be your trainer. So let's dive in. So at the end of this particular presentation, you should be able to have a background knowledge of what ISO 9001 is all about. That is, if you don't already know that. So if you already have that, you can actually speed up the video or you can fast forward it. Also, if you check in the comment, you notice that we've broken down the lessons based on the number of minutes, so feel free to skip any part which you probably already know. So another thing we're going to be able to accomplish at the end of this lesson will be to gain an overview of what ISO 9001 structure and certification process is like. So here we're going to talk about ISO 9001 structure, the clauses, the principles, and then also the fact that this is based on what we refer to as risk-based thinking. And then also we shall understand the audit approach, basically how to carry out audit using ISO 9001, and then also gather useful tips on how to handle an audit session. So basically when an audit is being conducted, maybe let's say certification audit within your organization, how exactly are you expected to behave or act in that circumstance? All of these are part of what we're going to be covering in this particular presentation. So by the time we're done with this presentation, I am reasonably sure that all of these points that I've mentioned here, you'll be able to understand them and then also be able to apply them, especially within your organization if you are seeking to get certified in ISO 9001. So understand that Ciel Consulting can also help you basically be able to implement management systems within your organization and then also help you through your certification process, especially if you want to certify your organization or you want to certify as an individual. We are actually an authorized training partner of Exemplar Global International. Okay, so I'm just going to show you that briefly before I proceed. Okay, good. So you can see it here. We are an authorized training partner of Exemplar Global International. Aside from that, we are also a partner of PECB, which is also what I'm going to show you here. Yeah, so this is our partnership letter with PECB. So basically, we have the requisite resources, accreditation to be able to help you as an individual attain your ISO certifications, as well as certifications for organizations if the need arises. Okay, thank you so much for that. And then of course we're just going to jump in straight to be able to explain to you essentially what ISO 9001 here refers to. So in a nutshell, the course will cover an overview of what ISO 9001 is, then of course what we refer to as ISO 9001 structure, then also the certification process, the audit approach, and like we mentioned earlier on, how to handle an audit session. All of these are part of the things that we're going to be looking at in the course of this very training. So let's take a look at the words of Edward Deming. According to Edward Deming said, "It is not enough to do your best. You must know what to do, then do your best." So this is actually a very powerful statement. In other words, it is not just enough for us to go ahead in the organization and keep putting in a whole lot of effort, keep putting in a whole lot of sacrifices, but then we're not able to fly it in the right direction. So what Edward Deming is simply saying is that in as much as we have to do the right thing, but we must also ensure that the right things are being done. So what I mean by that is there's a difference between doing things right and doing the right things. So you can see, like I mentioned, there's a difference between doing things right and then doing the right things. We can actually be doing things right, but the things we're doing are the wrong things. I don't know if you're following. Good. So that's typically what Edward Deming is simply trying to state here. That it's not just enough to do things right. It's not just enough for us to put in our best effort. But then we should ensure that those best effort we're putting in is with regards to the right thing. So this is where ISO comes in. ISO gives us what we refer to as standards. So the essence of the standard is to ensure that we are doing the right things. That is essentially what the standards do for us. So that we make sure that we're not dissipating our energy in the wrong endeavor, but then of course that what we're doing is the right thing, and then will ultimately help us in improving effectiveness as well as efficiency within our organization. So let's talk about ISO and then of course what it simply means. ISO simply means International Organization for Standardization. Of course, sometimes this is also referred to as International Standards Organization. It is a non-governmental organization established in 1947, and the head office is based in Geneva, Switzerland. It has over 160 national standard institutes from countries in all regions of the world. So basically, ISO is basically made up of different national standards institutes from different countries in the world. So standard institutes in different countries in the world came together to form what we now refer to as the ISO. So ISO has developed more than 18,000 standards for all dimensions of sustainable development, including economic, environmental, as well as societal. So in essence, we have over 18,000 standards. We have over 18,000 publications or standards as published by ISO that helps to enable us be able to carry out processes or functions within organization. And this, of course, cuts across both economic, environmental, as well as societal needs. So basically what ISO does is that they provide us with standards, and when we mention standard here, standard basically a layman's perspective of looking at standard is majorly like a standard operating procedure, or how best you can actually do things within the organization, and that's basically what ISO provides, which is what we refer to as standards. So some of the examples or some of the most popular standards which of course ISO publishes are ISO 9001, which refers to quality management system. In other words, this is a standard that talks about how to ensure quality within the organization. Then there's also the ISO 14001, which is the environmental management system. So this talks about how you are going to be able to protect the environment and then also ensure that in the course of carrying out operations within the organization, that the environment is taken care of and then of course is not affected adversely. There's also the ISO 27001, which is the information security management system. So in essence, ISO 27001 is a standard that talks about information security and then also how to be able to implement information security within your organization. Of course, there are also a couple of other standards, including one of the recent ones, which is ISO 45001, which basically talks about management systems for occupational health and safety. So this basically talks about how to ensure health and safety, especially within the workplace, and that's what ISO 45001 refers to. And like I mentioned earlier on, we also have standards for other endeavors in life, for example, food safety, and then of course asset management, that's ISO 55001, business continuity, that is 22301, and then also a host or a couple of other standards as well. So remember earlier on that we mentioned that the ISO basically is a combination or a group of national standard institutes coming together to form the body. So the American National Institute, that is the ANSI, is the US representative to the ISO. So now, remember our focus is on ISO 9001. So we're going to be talking about what ISO 9001 is. But first, I want you to be able to understand how the nomenclature comes about. So remember, ISO simply refers to International Organization for Standardization, or like I mentioned earlier on, International Standards Organization. So the ISO has what we refer to as TC. TC simply means Technical Committee. So Technical Committee is basically a group of subject matter experts who come together to provide or publish these standards that we have today. So typically when the technical committee comes or convenes or meets and then publishes or comes up with a new standard, the standard is given a unique coding system. So for example, for quality management system, the coding is ISO 9001. And then like we showed you earlier on, for environmental management system, the coding is ISO 14001. And we said that for health and safety, the code is 45001. That's ISO 45001. Now, beyond that, also notice that these standards get reviewed, they get revised periodically in order to bring them in line with current situations. So, anytime these standards are reviewed or anytime a new standard is published, the year that that particular standard was last reviewed or was published, if it is a new standard, is now attached to that particular code. For example, when you hear ISO 9001 2015, this simply means that this particular standard, which is ISO 9001, was last reviewed in 2015. Or you hear ISO 45001 2018. So this simply means that this particular standard was last reviewed by the technical committee in 2018. So the technical committee, they are the ones who are responsible for publishing the standard, and then like I mentioned earlier on, they review it intermittently in order to make it relevant to current realities. So ISO 9001 is arguably one of the most popular standards that is commonly used globally. And like I mentioned earlier on, ISO 9001 addresses the quality management system. So it is basically an international consensus on good management practices when it comes to quality. It focuses on meeting customer requirements as well as that of other interested parties. And then, of course, this is now contained in what we refer to as the standards requirements, which, of course, we're going to be taking a look at as we journey along. And don't forget that ISO 9001 can be applied to any organization. So it doesn't matter the size of the organization, because sometimes you see that small businesses, when you ask them to get their organization certified or to implement a quality management system or an ISO standard within the organization, some persons have the notion that, this is basically only for big organizations. But that is far from the truth, because it can cover any organization, no matter the size of the organization, the industry that you play in, the environment, or the culture. So the quick question now is, how does ISO 9001 work? So what ISO 9001 does basically is that it identifies what requirements you must meet. And those requirements are what are captured in the clauses. So in the ISO 9001 2015 standard, we have what to refer to as the clauses. So those clauses are the requirements that you must meet. So when we talk about implementing ISO 9001, basically, it is just about ensuring that you meet these requirements as contained within the standard. And then it does not tell you how to meet the requirements. So in essence, it tells you what to do, but not how to do it. Every organization chooses its own way of meeting the requirements. So you have the liberty to choose how you want to implement your management system. Sometimes I get calls from organizations that they are undergoing a particular audit, and then the auditor is telling them that the way and manner they chose to implement their management system, their quality management system, is not the right way. And then I tell them that the auditor doesn't have any concern with how the requirements were implemented. The major thing that the auditor should look out for is, what are the requirements and has the organization been able to meet those requirements? Because every organization is peculiar. Every organization has its own peculiarities. So how an organization decides to implement their own management system will be totally different from how another organization will choose to implement their own management system. And then also notice that there are no two management systems that are the same. So every management system is unique in the sense that it relates to the particular organization that is implementing that particular management system. And beyond that also, it is shaped by the environment in which the organization operates in, as well as the industry and the culture within that particular environment. So that's part of the reason why we said that there are no two management systems that are the same. So it is not something you can do a copy and paste. Maybe you go to another organization and then you see their management system and then you come and paste it in your own organization. No. You can't do a copy and paste with regards to management systems because every organization has its own unique peculiarities. Now, aside from that, it also allows for flexibility. In other words, you can decide as an organization to go beyond the requirements of the standards if you feel that it will be advantageous for you as an organization, and then also allows management to stay in the driving seat. So one of the major provisions of the ISO 9001 is leadership, and then it ensures that as much as possible that the management system is top driven. The management system implementation within the organization is top driven, and then of course had management support. So that's part of the reason why one of the major requirements of the ISO 9001 is the fact that leadership or management should be in the driving seat. So the question is, why is quality management system important? So if you follow the discussion that we had earlier on, remember we said that quality management system, which is ISO 9001, is published by the International Standards Organization, that is the ISO. And we mentioned that ISO is a culmination or a group of national standards, national standard institute that come together to form the ISO. And we mentioned that the ISO has technical committees who are subject matter experts. So these people are experts with regards to their field, and then they are now the ones who come together to come up with these standards. So it simply means that if you want your organization to become much more effective and efficient, then of course you have to model it in line with the provisions of these standards. So that's part of the reason why we're going to be talking about why quality management system is important. One, it will help you to achieve customer satisfaction, because a key component of the ISO 9001 basically is focus on customer, and then also help you to avoid high cost of poor performance. I mean, there's nothing as bad as you're spending money on rework or lost business or warranty, as the case may be. All of these are what we refer to as cost of poor performance. So one key thing that implementing the management system within your organization will help you accomplish is to reduce the cost of poor performance. It will also help you gain, repeat business. And then aside from that, it will also help you increase your profitability, because there is a huge connect between quality and profitability. If, for example, you are well known within the market space as being able to meet requirements, in other words, that your services and your products are of high quality, then there's a tendency that this is going to have a rub-off on your profitability. It also helps you to increase effectiveness as well as, maintain higher consistency. These are some of the benefits, or why it is important that you implement quality management system within your organization. And then of course, don't forget that sometimes in order to do business with other organizations, they would want to know if you have your ISO 9001 2015. In other words, have you been able to implement your management system, your quality management system, in line with the provisions of the standards? So these are part of the advantages that the certification would give you. So if you decide to take your organization further and get certified as an individual, some of the advantages would include: one, it could be a compliance with customer requirements specifying specific certification. So remember I mentioned this earlier on. Sometimes we get to do business with organizations and then they would ask us for our ISO 9001 certification. So there are some jobs you might be bidding for, some contracts you might be going for, and of course some of the requirements would include you have to have your ISO 9001 certification. And then also it's an independent check on conformity conformity. So it has to be able to prove that yes, as an organization, you've been able to implement the management system and you've been able to get a certifying body to independently check that your processes are aligned with the provisions of the standard. It also indicates an effective quality system within your organization, and then also gives you national as well as international recognition, and then also it provides you with competitive advantage and ultimately improves your company image. I mean, there's nothing as good as having that ISO 9001 certified company as part of your company signature or boldly written on your website. You can also have a situation where you have it contained even in your products as well as your services. So this basically is a seal of quality that shows that as much as possible, the organization is able to meet customers' requirements and then also able to fulfill quality expectation. So now let's talk about the origin of the ISO 9001 quality management system. So the ISO 9001 quality management system was first issued in 1987. So then it was known as ISO 9001 1987. And then, of course, in 1994, it was reviewed. So the second issue was in 1994. And then, of course, in year 2000, it was reviewed for the third time. Then it was referred to ISO 9001-2000. In 2008, it was reviewed for the fourth time. So the fourth issue was in 2008, and this was referred to as ISO 9001-2008. And then, of course, in 2015, the current review was done. So this is now known as ISO 9001-2015. This is essentially the fifth issue, and that's the latest version of the ISO 9001. So after a review has been done with regards to a standard, there's what we now refer to as a transition period. So the transition period is the period from the year of review to when you should be able to recertify your organization in the event that your organization was certified in line with the previous management system. So say for example, if you were certified in ISO 2000 and ISO 9001 2008, you have until 2018 to recertify. So this is essentially what we refer to as the transition period. So the recertification audits for new standard should be done within the transition period, typically as advised by the TC, that's the technical committee. Okay, next, we shall take a look at the improvements that we have in the ISO 9001 2015 version. So these are the key improvements that were recorded in ISO 9001 2015. One, it increased emphasis on achieving value for the organization and its customers. And then also a greater emphasis on leadership and organizational context was also a major part of the 2015 standard. The focus on risk-based thinking was also inculcated, and then also emphasis on objectives, measurements, and change. Then also stakeholder-focused communication and awareness, as well as decreased emphasis on documentation. So ISO 9001 2015 does not lay so much emphasis on documentation as was captured in ISO 9001 2008. So if we put the two provisions of the standards side by side, if you listen to my conversation earlier on, remember I told you that the standard or each of the standard is made up of what we refer to as clauses. So these are the clauses that we had in ISO 9001 2008, and then these are the clauses for ISO 9001 2015. So of course, the first four clauses remain, which includes the introduction, scope, normative references, and then also terms and definitions. And then the clause 4 under ISO 9001 2008 used to be known as quality management system. However, in 2015, this was now changed to context of the organization. And then we used to have clause 5 and 6 in 2008, which were known as management responsibility as well as resource management. However, in 2015, this was broken down to leadership, planning, and then of course the support. Then in 2008, we used to have product realization as one of the clauses. This was totally removed in 2015. And then, of course, here we have operation. And then we had a measurement, analysis, and improvement. But here we have performance evaluation and then, of course, improvement as the clauses in ISO 9001:2015. So in a nutshell, the ISO 9001:2015 has 10 clauses. However, ISO 9001:2008 had 8 clauses. So these are some of the major difference between these two standards. So in addition to what we have mentioned so far, ISO 9001 emphasizes on what we refer to as the process approach. And process approach, of course, includes understanding and meeting customer requirements, and then how do processes value add, and then ability to measure process performance as well as effectiveness, as well as continual improvement of processes based on measurement. So emphasis on process approach is one of the major differences between the ISO 9001:2008 and then, of course, ISO 9001:2015. Another major difference between the ISO 9001:2008 and the 2015 version is what we refer to as the risk-based management. So ISO 9001:2015 has what we call risk-based thinking. In other words, it emphasizes on appropriate risk management processes and measures being put in place in order to ensure that as much as possible we do a proper risk identification and then, of course, analysis. Then also we do what we refer to as response, and then ultimately we monitor and control risks that may affect our quality management system. So the whole goal of the risk-based management would includes to be able to improve customer confidence and satisfaction, then to assure consistency of quality of products and services, also to establish a proactive culture of prevention and improvement. So risk-based management basically focuses on preventive actions, and then successful companies intuitively take a risk-based approach. So remember, when we talk about risk basically refers to uncertainties, which of course can give rise to negative occurrence. So ISO 9001:2015 basically is focused on the concept of being prepared in the event that any threat or any negative thing happens. We are well ready to respond to it. However, most importantly, we should be able to implement preventive actions in order to ensure that such threats or risks do not happen. So some of the major benefits of the ISO 9001:2015 that we have would include: 1, it puts greater emphasis on leadership engagement. Aside from that, it helps address organizational risk and opportunities in a structured manner, and then also uses simplified language and a common structure and terms. When we talk about common structure simply refers to the 10 clauses structure, which is what we now refer to as a common structure. If you notice, recent revisions, so ISO standards, all of them were aligned to the common structure. That is essentially having what we refer to as 10 clauses. It also addresses supply chain management more effectively, and then ISO 9001:2015 is more user-friendly for service and knowledge-based organizations. So one of the reasons why ISO 9001:2015 puts a whole lot of emphasis on leadership engagement can be summarized by the word of Joseph M. Duran. And of course, I quote, he says, "It is most important that top management be quality-minded. In the absence of sincere manifestation of interest at the top, little will happen below." So in essence, if quality is not driven from the top, from top management, does not have leadership support, little will happen. Because if it does not have management support, then to a large extent, we may have a situation where staff members or other members of the organization will pay lip service to quality service delivery as well as product because it does not have senior management backing. So ISO 9001 is based on what we refer to as the PDCA cycle. If you remember, Edward Deming's plan, do, check, act cycle. So this is also the basis upon which ISO 9001 was based upon. So of course, we have the plan, then there's the do, there's also the check, and then of course there's the act. So remember we said earlier on that there are 10 clauses in ISO 9001-2015. So those 10 clauses are derived from the PDCA cycle, and we're going to take a look at that much more later in the course of this presentation. But first, let's talk about the 10 clauses that we have in ISO 9001-2015. So remember, like I mentioned earlier on, the 2015 version of the ISO 9001 is aligned with the common structure for management systems standards. So just like I mentioned earlier on, remember we said that we have technical committee that comes up with standards for each of the ISO management systems. So ISO also came up with what we refer to as a standard for its own standards. So that standard is what we now refer to as the common structure. That standard is the fact that subsequent standards that are published by ISO will follow this common structure. And what is the common structure? The 10 clauses structure, which of course is what we have here. So whether it is ISO 9001, ISO 45001, ISO 14001, if you notice, all of them follow this same structure, and that's essentially what we refer to as the common structure. So the clauses that we have with regards to ISO 9001 in line with the common structure are, we have what we refer to as the clause 1, which is scope, then the clause 2, the normative references, then clause 3, terms and definitions, then in clause 4, you have context of the organization, clause 5 is leadership, clause 6 is planning, clause 7 talks about support, clause 8 talks about operation, clause 9 talks about performance evaluation, and then of course clause 10 now focuses on improvement. So those are the 10 clauses that we have in ISO 9001. We're going to take a look at these clauses in a greater detail much more later, but please understand that ISO 9001 has 10 clauses, and the 10 clauses is essentially what we have talked about in this particular slide. So like I mentioned earlier on, the ISO 9001 clauses is based on what we refer to as the Edward Deming cycle, that is the PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. When we talk about plan, clauses 4, which is context of the organization, then of course clause 5, which is leadership, as well as clause 6, which is planning, is based on the plan part of the PDCA cycle. Then the do part of the PDCA cycle addresses the support as well as the operations clauses of the ISO 9001, while the check part of the PDCA cycle is aligned with what we refer to as the performance evaluation clause in ISO 9001. And then of course the act portion is now in line or based, and then of course improvement is now based on the act portion of the PDCA cycle. So notice that the PDCA cycle, as was advocated by Edward Deming, is a way of being able to build consistent increase within the organization, which emphasizes on the need for us to initially have what we refer to as a plan, then execute the plan, which is the doing part, then check to be able to determine if what we're doing is in line with what we planned, and then of course implement corrective actions, and then also improvement methods that will enable us to build consistent increase in the organization. So you can see that the ISO 9001 structure aligns with the PDCA cycle and ultimately helps in being able to build consistent increase or improvement within the organization. So taking a much more detailed look at the clauses that we have in ISO 9001-2015. So notice that we have the very first 3 clauses, which are, remember, we talked about scope, and then the second one is the normative references. And then the third one is what we now refer to as the terms and definitions. So if we talk about the very first one, which is scope, scope basically mentions that every ISO 9001-2015 quality management system should have a defined scope. Scope simply means boundary. So in essence, it should be with regards to maybe a particular organization or a branch in an organization or a unit within the organization. It can even be with regards to a function, process or a product within the organization. So that's what we refer to as the scope. So in essence, for you to be able to implement your management system with regards to quality, you need to first of all define the boundaries. You need to first of all establish the scope, the extent that the quality management system will cover. And that's the very first part. Then the second part is the normative reference. Normative reference simply refers to all the other documents, standards that are referenced in the ISO 9001-2015. That's what we refer to as normative reference. For example, ISO 9001, ISO 9004, ISO 19004. ISO 19001. All of these are normative references where specific set of attributes were gathered in order to come up with what we refer to as the ISO 9001 clause. Then the third part of the clauses that we have in ISO 9001 is the terms and definitions. So in the terms and definitions is where we now explain the various terms and definitions that we use within our quality management system. That's essentially where the terms and definitions come in. For example, if you notice in books, at the end of every chapter or at the end of the book, you're going to see what to refer to as index. Say, for example, index in books. So this basically helps us to explain the terms that we use, especially within our quality management system. Then we now have other clauses in the ISO 9001, which of course includes one, we have context of the organization. So the next is clause 4, which talks about the context of the organization. And then of course under the context of the organization, there are now what we call sub-clauses. So there are 4 sub-clauses under the context of the organization, which of course includes clauses 4.1, understanding the organization and its context. Then 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Then of course 4.3, determining the scope of the quality management system. And then also clause 4.4, the quality management system and its processes. So in summary, the context of the organization basically focuses on being able to determine internal and external issues that can actually affect the ability of the organization to achieve the intended results of its quality management system. So if, for example, we are auditing based on context of the organization, you need to be able to determine if the organization has been able to determine or identify internal and external issues based on its business environment that can actually affect the intended outcomes, and then also how are they monitoring and reviewing these issues. Then the clause 5 focuses on leadership. And then, of course, when we talk about the leadership clause, there are sub-clauses. So the sub-clauses you have in leadership would include leadership as well as commitment, then also quality policy, as well as organizational roles and responsibilities and authorities, which is clause 5.3. So in summary, the leadership clause basically focuses on leadership commitment. In other words, that top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to quality management system by taking specific actions such as accountability, also ensuring that quality policy as well as objectives are established, then also ensuring the integration of the quality management system's requirement in the organization's business processes, and then also communicating the importance of effective quality management as well as conformity to members of the organization. So if, for example, we are auditing with regards to leadership, some of the things the auditor may be on the lookout for would include, does the organization have a quality policy, quality objectives, and then of course these quality policy and objectives communicated to relevant stakeholders and also displayed as strategic points within the organization, and then also are resources available to support the implementation of the quality management system. Then does senior management promote the practice of risk-based thinking as well as the PDCA, that is the Plan, Do, Check, Act in the organization. All of these are essentially part of the various things that you should be on the lookout for, especially when you're checking to be able to determine if the organization has actually met the requirements of the leadership clause in ISO 9001. Then the next is now the planning for the quality management system. And again, this has its own sub-clauses. And the sub-clauses includes 1, actions to address address risk and opportunities, then also quality objectives and planning to achieve them. This is the clause 6.2, and then also planning for changes. So the planning part of the ISO 9001:2015 clauses basically focuses on the fact that when planning the quality management system, the organization shall consider the issues referred to in clause 4.1. Remember here we talked about, identifying internal and external issues that may prevent the organization from achieving its quality management system. So when it comes to planning, this is where we now make mention of the fact, or ISO refers to the fact that the organization shall now consider all those issues that were identified in clauses 4 and basically determine how to be able to address those issues, and then also measures to take to be able to ensure that those issues are prevented or that specific actions are taken to address them. So here, this is basically where you do a proper risk analysis, which of course would include the risk identification, analysis, evaluation, and then also coming up with relevant responses that may be implemented. So part of the things you should be on the lookout for, especially to know if you've met the requirements of this planning clause or when you are auditing, would include one, if the organization has any process to determine risk and opportunities, and then also whether clauses 4.1 and 4.2 are considered as inputs when determining these risks and opportunities. Then also you want to be able to determine how are risks identified as well as analyzed within the organization, and then also what is the acceptable risk criteria, as well as how risks are managed in the organization. All of these are part of the things you should be on the lookout for to enable you meet the requirements of the clause 6, which talks about planning for quality management system. Then clause 7 talks about support. Then when we talk about support here, ISO basically states that organizations shall determine and provide the relevant resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement of the management system. So in essence, the organization shall be able to provide the relevant resources, which is what 7.1 talks about. Then relevant skill set, which is what competence or 7.2 talks about. And then of course awareness, training, capacity building, and then communication, which is what subclause 7.4 focuses on, as well as documentation as it were. So if we are going to be auditing or to be able to determine if you've met the requirement of the clause 7, which is support, you should be looking at the organization's investment in its human resources, and then also training that the organization has carried out, its staffing needs, as well as the resources. Beyond that, you may also want to be on the lookout for ways that the organization monitors and measures resources to be able to determine if they conform with the requirements of the standard. Then also you may also want to be on the lookout for evidence of records of fitness of these resources. Then for example, things like test certificates, and then also monitoring devices, and then all as well as calibration instructions. So all of these are some of the things you may be on the lookout for to be able to ensure that the organization has met the requirements that you have in clause 7. Then in clause 8, this is where we now talk about operation. So there are 7 sub-clauses under clause 8, which of course includes clause 8.1, which is operational planning and control, 8.2, determination of requirements for products and services, 8.3, design and development of products and services, 8.4, control of externally provided products and services, 8.5, production and service provision, 8.6, release of products and services, as well as 8.7, control of non-conforming process outputs, products, as well as services. So the summary of the operation clause basically is the fact that ISO is saying that the organization shall plan, implement, and control the processes needed to meet the requirements for the provisions of products and services, and then also implement actions that will enable it to be able to meet the requirements of its products and services. So some of the things you may be on the lookout for here would include 1, the product and service acceptance criteria, then also resources availability. You may also want to be on the lookout for quality plans, especially with regards to products and services. then also project development schedules and plans, outsource processes and controls and how they are managed, and then how does the organization control planned changes and how the organization reviews the consequences of unintended changes. These are part of the things that you should be on the lookout for to be able to determine if your organization has actually met the requirement of clause 8, which is operations. Then clause 9 now talks about performance evaluation. So when we talk about performance evaluation, basically, this clause talks about our ability to check, to be able to determine if we are carrying out our management system in line with the provisions of the standard. So here, we shall be able to determine what needs to be monitored, then also methods with which we are going to monitor, analyze, and evaluate the needed results, and evaluate our process. Then also when the results from monitoring and measurement shall be analyzed as well as evaluated. So some of the sub clauses that you have with regards to clause 9 includes sub clause 9.1, which is monitoring, measuring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. Then 9.2, which is internal audit. This specifically states that the organization shall conduct internal audit to be able to determine how well the organization meets the provisions of the standard. And then of course management review, which is 9.3, where basically the management now sits down to take a look at the outcome of the internal audit and then of course determine on actions to take in order to meet any non-conformity that may be identified in the course of the internal audit. So some of the things you should be on the lookout for here would include, one, as the organization does in its internal audit, you might also want to take a look at the audit plans as well as schedules, the audit report, audit notes, non-conformity reports, action catalogs, and then of course also reports of management reviews. All of these things are part of the things you can actually, check to be able to determine if the organization has met the requirement of the performance evaluation clause. Then the final clause is now the improvement clause, which is the clause 10. So basically, clause 10 focuses on the fact that the organization shall select opportunities for improvement and then, of course, implement any necessary actions to meet customer requirements and enhance customer satisfaction. So here, the 10th clause basically is focusing on that the organization shall take specific steps to ensure that there's continuous improvement in its service delivery as well as in its product provisions. The sub clauses that you have in 10.1 would include, we have general, then also non-conformity and corrective action, as well as continual improvement. So basically, some of the things that we should be on the lookout for would include, you want to see non-conformity records with actions that have been taken, then also systems approach with which we identify root cause analysis, then also measures that the organization takes in order to avoid non-conformities, as well as maybe a continual service improvement record, and then also ways of improving the process performance. These are things that will help you know whether your organization actually meets or has met with the provisions of the clause 10, which basically talks about improvement. So we have taken a summary look at the clauses as well as the sub-clauses that we have in ISO 9001:2015. So remember we said that there are 10 clauses, which are scope, which talks about boundary, normative references, which talks about references where contents were derived from, then terms and definitions, which basically explains the terms we have in our quality management system, then context of the organization, which talks about the fact that we should identify internal and external issues that may affect the quality management system, then leadership, which basically talks about the fact that there should be leadership support and the implementation and running of our management system should be top driven, then also planning, which also focuses on the fact that we should do our risk analysis, including identification, and then also coming up with relevant risk responses and how to address them. And then also you talk about clause 7, which is support, which basically mentions that we should senior management shall be able to provide relevant resources, competence, as well as relevant information needed to successfully maintain maintain and implement our quality management system. Then operations. Here we took a look at basically how we are going to be able to develop relevant plans that will enable us to be able to implement products or implement projects within the organization. And then of course under the check part we have the next clause, which is performance evaluation, which in summary we took a look at how to monitor and measure performance within the organization, including internal audit as well as management review. And finally we now talk about improvement, which now talks about how to be able to address non-conformities, corrective actions, and then also ultimately build consistent increase or continual improvement within the organization. So if you choose to get certified with regards to ISO 9001, this is the process that you actually need to follow. So first, you need to begin by implementing the quality management system, just like I have mentioned here. And then of course, part of the things you do during this implementation would include, you need to first of all do a gap analysis to be able to determine, what you have within the organization and what is missing. And then make sure that there is relevant training. You need to build the capacity of your team, internal auditor, lead implementer, and then also people in the organization should also be aware. So this is where you train them so that they understand the provisions of the standard itself. And then of course after that you now go to documentation, where you now come up with the mandatory documents as required by the standard, which of course would include some of the documents we've mentioned, like your quality policy, objectives, quality manual, and then of course vision and mission statements, and then also procedures, as well as forms and work instructions. So these are some documents that you should develop in order to meet with the requirements of the standards. And then of course after the documentation, you now do what you now refer to as the implementation. So implementation is where you now implement what you have captured in those documents by first of all creating awareness on the content of the document, and then also making it available to relevant units who will be responsible for maintaining them, using them, and then also ensuring that they run their processes in line with the specifications of the clauses as contained in the documentation. So at the end of this implementation process, then you now do your internal audit. So during your internal audit, this is basically where you now audit to using the provisions of the clauses to be able to determine if the organization has met with the requirements of those particular clauses. So all of these are part of what you do during the implementation of your QMS. So I've given you basically how you go about implementing your quality management system. And like I mentioned earlier on, after the implementation, you now conduct internal audit and then review the internal audit results with your top management. And then of course after that, you select a certification body that will certify your organization. So there are different certification bodies which of course can be used for this particular process. So your choice of certification body should be determined by your environment, what you hope to accomplish, and then also what happens within your own industry. So the certification body will now come and do what we call a stage 1 audit. So during the stage 1 audit, basically this is where they will now check your documentations to be sure that these documentations are aligned with the requirements of the quality management system, that is the ISO 9001. Then they will now do a second stage audit. So second stage audit is where they will try, the certification body using its auditors will try to be able to confirm the implementation of your quality management system in the organization. So here they do a lot of interviews, they will do a whole lot of evidence seeking to be able to determine that yes, you don't just have it in the document, but then they are actually being followed or practiced within the organization. And then of course, if all of this goes according to plan, then the certification body will now give you a confirmation that you have met with the requirements of the standard, and then they will give a recommendation that your organization should be certified. And then of course, you will now be awarded with the ISO 9001 certificate. Okay, now once you are awarded with the ISO 9001 certificate, there will now be what we call surveillance audit as well as continual improvement audit. So this is basically done on an annual basis, where the certification body comes to check to be sure that you're still maintaining your quality management system and you've not deviated from the provisions of your quality management system. So internal audit is basically a self-check process So in essence, we're checking ourselves before we bring in external auditors who will come and do the certification audit. So the essence is to ensure that the whole quality system is audited, to check the system is being followed, and then also the system meets the ISO 9001 requirement, as well as the system is effectively implemented and maintained. So these are some of the things we do, especially with regards to internal audit. So it focuses on employees' understanding of the organization's processes and verifies that these processes are complied with, under control, and then of course achieving the desired results. So just like every other audit, internal audit should be evidence-based. So in other words, you should be able to show material evidence that these processes are being complied with. So some of the things that can show this evidence would include records, meeting of minutes, reports, data, emails, and then of course any other document that will prove that the organization is meeting with the requirements of the quality management system. But then in as much as documentation is key to support evidence or to support the fact that your quality management system is being implemented, but most importantly, result as well as measurement are the key things that you should be on the lookout for, especially as an auditor, in order to be able to know whether, yes, are we actually doing the right thing. Because if you have a situation where sometimes organizations would meticulously keep these documentations, but then they are not following what is in the documentations, and beyond that, you're also not seeing the result of all of that in the organization. It's not leading to maybe greater customer satisfaction, it's not leading to increased return on investment or profitability, or ultimately greater level of satisfaction within the organization. So if all of that, you're not noticing all of that as an auditor, obviously you know that something is obviously wrong with the quality management system as being implemented. So at the end of audit, these are some of the findings that could actually result from the audit process. We have what we call a major non-conformity, then it could be a minor non-conformity, and then maybe an observation. So major non-conformity can be absence of evidence to show or prove a particular that a particular requirement has actually been complied with. So that can be termed a major non-conformity. Say for example, we talk about competence, and then as an auditor, you're asking how the organization ensures that staff members continually build their competence, and then they tell you, okay, we conduct trainings, we send staff members for trainings, and then also we require them to gain relevant certifications, and then you ask for an evidence, and they're not able to show you a training plan, they're not able to show you training certificates, course completion certificates, they're not able to show you evidence of the fact that this is being done, and then that staff members have actually added value to themselves over the years. That can be termed a major non-conformity. Then a minor non-conformity is basically a non-conformity that happens due to minor incidents. Say for example, you are reviewing a minute of meeting, and then you discover that a particular portion was skipped, or some portion of the minute were not properly worded. So these are some of the things you can refer to as a minor non-conformity. In other words, absence of which does not affect the quality management system. Those non-conformities are referred to as minor non-conformities. Then of course we now have observations. So observations could be things that the auditor has noticed, and then could also mean that there are certain things within the management system that the organization is doing absolutely well. The auditor can actually give recommendations or commendations on that particular standard, on those particular requirements that are being adhered to, especially within the organization. So when an audit is being conducted, so understand that audit is not a fault-finding process, but a fact-finding process. The reason why audit is being conducted is basically to help the organization to improve its processes and functions. So it's how to be able to ensure that we build consistent increase. And then the result of the audit could be non-conformities, which of course will now enable us know where we are not meeting the provisions of the requirements and what we now need to do to be able to address that, which is where corrective actions come in. So if we look at it from that perspective, you notice that audit is not a bad thing, because sometimes when an audit is being conducted, you see people panicking, you see people jittery, and then some persons feel it's the end of the world. No, that shouldn't be the case. So these are ways you can conduct yourself during an audit. Do not panic. Ask and clarify where necessary. Admit obvious non-conformities. If there are non-conformities, do not try to hide it or do not try to cover things up. Admit when there are non-conformities. The worst that can happen is there will be a report on those non-conformities, and then of course you'll be given the opportunity to address the non-conformities. Also, offer evidence and explain patiently. Then take note of improvement areas highlighted by the auditor, and then also show internal audit report when necessary. So these are some of the ways you should conduct yourself during an audit session. Beyond that, you should also be polite, professional, positive and receptive to the auditor. You should also be sincere, like I mentioned earlier on. There's no need telling lies in the course of the audit or trying to deceive the auditor. And then show commitment. And then of course have what we call formal but not overly serious. So these are some of the auditees' conducts that would help to ensure that in the course of carrying out audit, that the audit is successfully done. Audit is not a do or die affair. As an employee, you have to pay cooperative attitude towards an audit. I mean, I've seen a couple of obituaries in my life, but I have never seen an obituary that states that this person died as a result of an audit. So notice, like I mentioned earlier on, it's not a do or die affair. Audit basically helps us to build. Is a fact-finding and not a fault-finding mission. So in a nutshell, we took a look at ISO 9001 and we talked about how ISO 9001 came about. We also mentioned that the latest version of ISO 9001 is the ISO 9001 2015. Subsequently, we also talked about the clauses that we have in ISO 9001, the 10 of them, which include scope, normative reference, terms and definitions, then context of the organization. We also talked about leadership, and then we also talked about planning, and then of course clause 7, which is support, then clause 8, which is operation, then clause 9, which is performance evaluation, as well as clause 10, which is improvement. We took a look at the sub clauses as well for each of these clauses, and then after that we talked about internal audit and how to conduct oneself during an internal audit. Remember, we said that audit is not a do or die affair and that staff members should pay cooperative attitude when audit is being carried out within the organization. So last word, in the race for quality, there is no finish line. This is according to David Cairns, former CEO of Xerox. So what it simply means is, if you implement the quality management system in your organization and you're getting results, always know that there is always a room for improvement, and then you can always get better and keep building consistent increase. I hope you find this particular presentation helpful and helps you to be able to implement quality management system within your organization. If you need further support and encouragement, you can reach out to us using the contact details in the next slide. You can reach out to us using the contact details in the next slide. And then of course, if you need further clarifications about how to implement this, we are there to support you. And then also we are there to basically give you the consultancy you will need. I hope this particular presentation has been very informative for you. Once again, thank you for listening. If you found it helpful and you want to proceed further with becoming certified in ISO 9001, please feel free to take the courses that we have for ISO 9001 lead auditor as well as lead implementer certifications. This will help you to build your skill in this particular certification and ultimately become certified as an individual or an organization with regards to ISO 9001. Please click on the link below to find out more details, and then of course I wish you the best in your future endeavors. Thank you so much for watching.